before moving on to the next paper, next set of topics, is partly summarize a little bit of what I mentioned at the end of the last lecture about this Ho and Lee paper, but do it in sort of the language of this slide and try to highlight what exactly these structural models are right now doing and what are they controlling for. And then on top of that, what is it assuming about, let's say, these Nash-Barton parameters and how they're held fixed. And so what I want to emphasize is, what these theory models and these structural models are doing is when we conducted counterfactuals, really taking seriously what happens to what we call, agreement and disagreement points. So when I talk about bargaining leverage, let's say increasing or decreasing, when I mean by leverage, I really am thinking about the relative difference between disagreement to agreement payoffs. The smaller is this wedge, this difference, the less, let's say in this case, upstream firm I relies on downstream firm J. So there's a sense in which maybe it has more leverage over J because it doesn't rely upon him that much. So let's think about the counterfactual that I ran, or I discussed at the end of the last lecture, where you had 3 downstream firms who are all contracting with upstream hospitals. And the counterfactual that we're trying to run would be eliminating one downstream firm from the market. Prior to this removal, prices between hospitals and insurers were negotiated according to this expression. After this removal, they're still negotiated according to this equation in equilibrium, but the values of these objects have changed. Now, as I mentioned, we're holding fixed these B parameters, but there's still a lot of action going on in the counterfactual within these brackets. And so for the intuition for why is it that when we remove an insurer, let's say prices might go down, is as follows. Right? If you think about upstream firm 1 or hospital 1 negotiating with downstream firm 1, what happens when now downstream firm 2 is eliminated? Well, clearly, we think these agreement payoffs have changed. Right? There's a new equilibrium in premiums. There's a new equilibrium in prices. But let's just focus on what happens to disagreement points. Previously, this upstream firm I, or this hospital 1 here, had another insurer from which it was getting patients. Now, if that insurer is no longer there, it's going to sort of suffer more upon disagreement with insurer 1. That is, its disagreement payoff is worse. Right? So this will be greater. On the other hand, for the insurer, downstream firm 1, now that his rival is missing, one of his rivals is gone, he's not going to be harmed as much if he drops this hospital. Consumers may have switched to D2 and D3 if that occurred, but now they really only have one other option. So now the insurer's leverage is greater, sort of has a stronger bargaining position. And so that dynamic is going to lead, let's say if we hold fixed premiums, to a lower negotiated price for the hospitals in the market when an insurer is removed. Now that's happening even as we fix these bargaining powers. Okay? And so absent a model of where these are coming from, this paper and others have held them fixed. Now, some people have suggested what happens if we were to parameterize these based on observables, and then perhaps we can model how these observables might change in the counterfactual. Then we're starting to work towards, seeing how they might change. But for now, this is really where these papers have focused their attention on, and less so there. That's not to say, however, that you're not capturing what we think of as important economic mechanisms and changes. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say on this paper. Before I move on before I move on to the next set, Mike, I think, wanted to say a few things.
I just wanted to say one or two things. Sorry. No, I don't.
You want that? Okay. Well, for
just one or two things, kind of motivational about this. Do you want me to say paper? So, for example, there have been a number of antitrust cases in the U.S. Recently where the merging parties, one of their arguments, when you're evaluating a merger, you're thinking about, on the one hand, it may market power and raise prices. On the other hand, there may be efficiencies that lower costs and therefore could lower prices that help consumers. So in the U.S., the test is, will it lower prices to consumers? So there have been a number of mergers recently where the merging parties have basically, one of their big arguments for efficiencies is that they could lower the cost of input. Okay, they could manage to procure their inputs for lower prices after they merge. So, I think one of the interesting things about this and where you can sort of see the benefits of the bargaining model, if you took a really simple view of, like, before thinking about these bargaining models, you might say to yourself, okay, how could the merging parties lower their input prices? Well, if you think, okay, they're creating a monopsony, something like a monopsony, the answer you would have is, well, the only way they could do that is by reducing the quantities that they are buying. But reductions in quantity, would, lead to higher prices downstream, not lower prices. So kind of at a first level, you kind of, before thinking about these kind of bargaining models, you would say that, wonder whether that story could make sense, that you could have a merger, it would lower input prices and even though market power increased, at that intermediate level, say that the prices, because of the cost reductions, prices would go down. So this model is one, when you introduce this bargaining model, is a model that actually can make sense of that. Okay, so you can see that starting to introduce this kind of thing can start making sense of some things that are kind of hard to think about otherwise. Kind of just while we're on the subject of while I'm mentioning mergers, if you instead were thinking about mergers of the upstream firms, say mergers of the hospitals, you're not talking about Gary.
No, I'm not.
So there's another paper that
Interesting thing that Mike just brought up, just building on what he said about Garrett Finger, Novell, and Town. When you're predicting the effects of a hospital merger, you also want to think not just about the bargaining parameters, but how substitutable or perhaps complementary these products are. And Gautam and some others have some work showing that if the products that are merging upstream can be seen as complements. What I mean by that is, from this perspective of downstream profits, there's a greater gain to having the marginal contribution of each is actually greater when the other one is also there. Which has this weird counterintuitive implication that if there's a merger and you believe prices are negotiated Nash-in-Nash both pre and post merger, and the bargaining power is fixed, you might actually get a reduction in the prices. Which means that when we adopt these models, again, we want to be very careful that we're using realistic demand primitives, let's say, that can admit rich forms of both substitutability and complementarities, both at the upstream and the downstream levels. But just one of the points that come out of that other paper as well. That's anything else? Oh, well, thanks, Mike. Any questions, by the way, before we move on to a different market? All right, great. So let me just, maybe it's easier if I just good. Okay. So I'm actually going to do the next two papers out of chronological order. This paper here is a recent one in vertical integration. It builds upon and relies heavily on earlier work by Greg Crawford and Ali Yurkuku, published in 2012. But because this is sort of a bit newer and closer in how it approaches the problem as the previous papers, I thought it might be more natural to start here. And then just summarize, if you will, the differences and findings of that second paper after this one. Okay. So now let's talk about cable television. This paper attempts to empirically measure the welfare effects of vertical integration in the multi-channel television industry. In the multi-channel television industry in the US, you want to think of consumers subscribing to one of typically 3 or so distributors in a market. When they subscribe to a distributor, they get access to that distributor's bundle of channels. Right? So you might think of in many markets there being a single cable operator and 2 satellite distributors, Dish and DirecTV. There is some variation in the bundles that they offer in terms of the channels that you can watch. Okay? And what's going on in this industry typically is that distributors and channels or content providers negotiate over an affiliate fee, that is a per subscriber linear price paid by the distributor to each channel. To get a sense of magnitudes, many channels get paid something on the order of $1 per subscriber. Certain channels like ESPN can get paid $5, $6 per subscriber per month. So if you think that in the US, there's about 100 million television households who subscribe to cable, which many get ESPN, that means ESPN is getting paid about $500 million per month in these affiliate fees. And that's before you start talking about advertising revenues and other sources of revenues for this channel. Okay. Anyways, these negotiations determine a lot of sort of significant amount of transfers. And really, these types of vertical integration cases have been coming up more and more often. In particular, there's been a recent merger case that Mike alluded to, AT&T Time Warner, that was just approved by a judge over the DOJ's objections. Okay. Now, there's been quite a large literature on the theoretical effects of integration, what could or couldn't happen when an upstream firm merges with a downstream firm. And they've typically been focusing on both the anti-competitive effects of such a merger and the efficiency effects. So I'll talk about what those are. But really, and what this paper attempts to do is sort of contribute to the more limited empirical evidence on what are the actual magnitudes of these effects, right? Just the fact that they could exist is not really that useful when you're trying to evaluate whether a merger should or should not happen. Okay, so that's what this paper is going to try to going to attempt to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about these 2 types of effects of integration, and let's do it in the context of a very stylized industry diagram, where let's say there's only really 2 distributors. We're going to call them F and G. They bundle channels provided by content providers, here C and D. They bundle them together and then resell them to consumers in the form of some package. Right? Now, let's say channel C and F become integrated. They now have the same owner, and let's say they internalize each other's profits, so when they make any strategic decisions, they're jointly profit maximizing. Okay. The standard efficiencies typically involve things related to double marginalization, right? Prior to the merger, the upstream content provider might have been charging this downstream distributor a linear affiliate fee. That linear affiliate fee is then marked up by the distributor to consumers. Well, what happens if the downstream distributor now internalizes the true marginal cost of serving an additional viewer, which is maybe close to 0 or 0? Well, then we might think the prices here might fall and quantities increase, right? So there's an efficiency there. There's a little bit of there's a slight caveat here, right? This channel may be contracting or selling its content to a rival distributor. So maybe when F reduces its price, or increases its price, rather, if it increases its price, maybe it drives more consumers to G. And if G pays C a pretty high affiliate fee, C might actually like that, right? So there's some other effect pointed out by Chen that might mitigate the efficiencies here, relaxation, double marginalization. There's another potential efficiency here, which we're going to sort of focus on in our paper as well, in that in the multi-channel television market, even though we've written these as sort of big entities F and G, each F and G really operate in many different many different markets, collections of zip codes, right? So F, even though he's a contract with C or D, he may not wish to carry the channel in every market he operates in. The reason why is because for every market he operates in, he has to pay the channel some per viewer per month fee if he carries a channel. So if there's a market where no one really cares about that channel, maybe the distributor doesn't put it on that system and save on some affiliate fees. Well, actually now if affiliate fees become closer to the true marginal cost of provision, well, maybe F is going to carry it more in more markets, and you're going to have a welfare increase. Okay. So those are two types of efficiencies we're going to try to quantify and measure in this paper. And on the anti-competitive effects, we're going to be focusing on these so-called foreclosure effects. What now happens when downstream distributor F internalizes C's profits? Well, let's ask what happens to C when it negotiates with G. Right, this is these downstream foreclosure effects, if you will. Well, C, when it previously negotiated with G, ignoring F's profits, might think there were gains from trade. Right? Well, there's more viewers that G reaches. I can charge some price per viewer. That's good. But now if C supplies G, he now knows that, well, people are going to substitute away from F to G. And if there are positive downstream margins for F, that's lower profits for F. And C may actually no longer want to supply G anymore because that's harming F. And that we would think of as complete foreclosure, that C would just not supply G. What? No supply is this. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So I think the question is, or instead of not supplying at all, C may still find it profitable to supply G, but there's now an opportunity cost of charging G a low price, basically foregone sales to F. So you might actually support a higher fee in equilibrium after integration that's charged to G. So you might think this is partial foreclosure, or maybe people have called it raising rivals' costs argument for why integration leads to higher fees to rivals. Okay? Now there's another type of foreclosure one might be worried about, which we're actually going to not consider in this paper for a few reasons, which talk about offline, in that now F, because he's integrated with C, may no longer wish to carry D, or may demand a higher price, or rather, only be willing to pay a lower price to D for carriage. Right? And that would happen if C and D are competitors, and maybe there's competition for advertising revenues. So maybe F, by not carrying D, weakens D in the advertising market and allows C to charge higher advertising prices. Maybe. Okay? So that's also something that you want to consider as well. Does that make sense? So what we're going to try to do is use data from many different sources and a structural model of how bargaining, pricing, demand, viewership happen to be able to conduct this type of horse race, if you will, between the efficiency and the anti-competitive effects. So what we're going to be looking at in the US is not sort of these national channels that you might have in the back of your mind, these CNNs, the Turner networks, Home and Garden Television, Food Network. We're instead going to be focusing on regional sports networks. These are basically channels that carry the local professional sports team, and for various contractual reasons with the sports leagues, only really operate in sort of a narrowly defined geographic market, typically in the markets around the team that they carry, their stadiums, right? So if you happen to be in Boston, there's a channel called Nash-in, New England Sports Network, that carries the Red Sox games, and they basically broadcast more or less in New England and not so much elsewhere. Okay. We're going to be looking at regional sports networks for a few reasons. First, because there's significant variation both across regions and over time in ownership patterns. So we see certain markets, geographic markets, where the RSN is integrated with a dominant cable provider, and in other markets, it's completely independent. Okay? There's also significant time variation of ownership as well. There's also, interestingly, some regulatory details that are actually useful for estimating our model. Generally speaking, the FCC has these things called program access rules, which by and large restrict the extent to which an integrated channel may be withheld from rival distributors. They're seriously concerned that, let's say, Comcast, back when, let's say, Time Warner Cable, back when they had a relationship with CNN, might not provide CNN to satellite distributors. If it didn't provide CNN to those distributors, maybe more people would subscribe to Time Warner Cable. Maybe. Right? And so these program access rules prevented the extent to which that could occur. However, there were these loopholes that existed that allowed withholding of content to rivals in certain circumstances. And some of those circumstances applied actually to regional sports networks. And those were known as a terrestrial loophole. Okay. This paper, like many others, are going to synthesize the data it uses from a variety of sources. Ali, if you want to chime in and talk a little bit about sort of what was involved with this. But basically, we were able to obtain rich individual level viewership and subscription patterns. We got to see channel lineups from a variety of, from many different markets, as well as collected ownership integration status. But I don't know if there's, sorry for calling you out there. What's very useful is this information on channel lineups. That is to say, for a few thousand cable markets, we knew exactly which channels were or were not included on the bundle. Okay? And this could be for this, a Comcast system in this zip code and a Comcast system in that zip code might have very different bundles. Right? And we're able to condition on that when estimating our model. And what's the model is going to have multiple stages. There's going to be some downstream consumer decision for how consumers choose which distributor to subscribe to, and then conditional on subscribing to a distributor, how they allocate their time in terms of watching channels. I'll come to why we care about how consumers choose to allocate their time. It seems a little maybe in the weeds, but it's going to provide a valuable input into the rest of the model. Okay? The second thing is how do these distributors, or multi-channel video programming distributors, that's the acronym there, choose how to price their bundles and choose which channels to carry. And finally, how is it that these downstream and upstream firms bargain with one another? Again, as I mentioned, it's going to extend or sort of build upon the methods brought up in Crawford and Yurkoglu to analyze essentially vertical mergers and integration. One of the sort of extensions that this paper spends some time discussing is to allow for the possibility that within an integrated firm, different units may not perfectly internalize the other's profits or incentives. Right? There's no reason to suggest that just by buying a firm, suddenly now everything is sort of hunky-dory, perfectly aligned, managers are doing what's in the best interest of joint profit maximization. Right? Maybe there are some frictions and some wedges, some agency issues that arise that prevent that from happening. And if that's true, it will affect, potentially, the predictions of whether integration is a good thing or a bad thing. And there's also then a question, if we're adding another sort of layer of complexity, is there variation in the data that would let us actually get at this? Can we see in the data evidence that firms indeed, when they integrate with one another, do not act in what's in the collective best interest of the firm? Okay? And then we're going to use this model once estimated to simulate mergers and divestitures for 26 different regional sports networks in 2007 and measure and quantify the efficiency and foreclosure effects described in the previous slide. So that's the goal. Yes?
This extension with the implicit integration, it's like really interesting, but it's kind of strange that it's embedded in a very already complicated paper. So why do this here?
Well, I think one answer is, and it gets motivated by the question of the paper is to measure the efficiency or foreclosure effects, like the welfare effects of vertical integration.
Okay.
We would say we can't really do a good job of answering that question without really taking a stand on this.
Okay.
And we want to be flexible. We won't want theory to dictate that just because you merge, it must be that firms are profit maximizing across all divisions instantly, right?
But that's true for all previous this kind of analysis that's been going on for years. So nobody had the data to estimate this. Is that the
I can't speak for the previous papers. I'm saying that we have some data that might allow us to shed light on this question, which is why we chose to include it.
So,
Sorry.
I mean, I can say, like the literature on vertical integration it looked a lot at trying to predict when you would have integration, like there's this whole Williamson transaction cost economics literature and stuff. Much less looking at like what the effects were, and a change in behavior, whether you actually would have internalization, things like that. So.
All right. So just to get a sense of the data, I'm going to show you sort of things that you can't possibly read. But this first figure is kind of neat in that it shows, and you can't see it because I'm going to zoom in, right? What it does, it shows for these 26 RSNs over time, how is it that ownership structure is varying, and also across channels. So what you want to read from this, not that you can sort of read the text, but the fact that these numbers and shadings are different indicate that, you know, owners of these channels are changing, right? And there's going to be some cross channel variation. So there's a whole slew of channels that are called Comcast Sportsnet. Unsurprisingly, they're owned at least partially by Comcast. There's a set of channels owned by the News Corporation, Fox Sports Networks, which had some ownership overlap with a satellite distributor. And there are others down here, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's on the ownership side. On here, again, very small, but what we have is basically for 10 years, information across thousands of cable systems, the prices, the market shares, the channels that are served, that are offered, rather, so on and so forth. Okay? And this allows us to potentially identify quite a few parameters at many different stages of a industry model, right? And again, even though these industry models are complicated, they're still very stylized representations of reality, okay? But this timing might seem similar in that we're going to assume that there's some stage one at which many strategic decisions involving these firms are decided. Those decisions include what are the affiliate fees paid between an upstream firm and a downstream firm. In this paper, we're going to call those things TAUs. Those are the linear per subscriber fee paid by distributor to a channel if there's agreement. Okay? Simultaneously with that bargaining, we're going to assume that these distributors are going to choose downstream prices P for a bundle of channels. For the smaller, we're going to assume that each distributor really only offers one bundle of channels in each market, but prices can be market specific. Okay? And then they also choose in each market which channels do I want to offer. The more channels I offer, the better quality product I have, the more I can charge for it, perhaps the more viewers I'll get, but the marginal cost of offering that bundle go up because every channel is associated with a positive marginal cost or affiliate fee from the perspective of the distributor. Once that stage concludes, we're going to assume that households choose the best distributor that's available to them in their market to subscribe to, and then they're going to choose which channels to watch. Okay? Now, stage 2 and 3, there's this sort of continuous decision in terms of how much they watch, a discrete decision of which distributor to subscribe to, sort of related to another set of papers there. As I'll come to in a little bit, it's going to be important to control for selection of people onto different distributors when we estimate these various stages of our model. In that, people who subscribe to cable television are probably different than the people who don't subscribe to cable television. And if you're someone who subscribes to Comcast because it has, let's say, Animal Planet and not DirecTV, which doesn't, maybe you're more predisposed to watching Animal Planet. And you want to condition on that selection on unobservable heterogeneity when estimating things. All right. Key here again, note that all these decisions happen simultaneously, which is going to simplify some of the objects that we derive and that we take to the data. Right. As before, when I sort of dive into this model, I'm going to proceed in reverse order and start off with this viewership model. But any questions yet in terms of why so far we're doing what we're doing or what we're doing? Okay. Let's talk about this viewership model, which generalizes the one that was developed in Crawford and Eurocoglu. And the point of this viewership model is to be able to predict viewership patterns for any arbitrary bundle of channels. Well, why do we care about viewership? Well, one, viewership affects channel profits in the form of advertising revenues. In this paper, we believe a channel makes more money if it has more viewers because they get paid more by advertisers. And if you don't know How that changes when a channel is added or dropped to a bundle or to a distributor, you don't have a shot at measuring these profits. Okay? Secondly, we're going to use this viewership model to generate an internally consistent measure of utility for a bundle of channels. Much like in the last paper, we took a model of hospital demand to construct an internally consistent measure of a bundle of hospitals when estimating insurance demand. We're going to use this viewership model to construct the utility that people get from having access to this set of channels or that set of channels when choosing which distributor to sort of subscribe to. Now, if we had more variation in the bundles that are offered in the data, maybe we wouldn't need to rely on a viewership model to tell us, well, if you had ESPN, you get this many more subscribers. If you didn't, you lose this many. Or if you added this channel and that channel. The problem is many channels in the data are available in pretty much all bundles we see. So we're going to try to predict what would happen if a distributor had a disagreement with a channel that maybe is always carried everywhere. We're going to use viewership data to help us infer what that would look like. Okay? So how does the viewership model go? Well, it assumes that every household has access to a certain set of bundles. It has some time that household I wants to allocate across different channels or to non-television activities, because there's other things you could do, I guess, than watch TV. There's some time constraint, and this is the utility it gets from this sort of time allocation. Okay? The functional form I'm not going to get too much into, but I want to say how you interpret this is, well, if you watch a particular channel for some amount of time W, we're going to assume the utility you derive from that amount of time spent watching channel W is a function of some gamma, which you want to think of as the marginal utility of watching that channel, and some parameter nu, which is how rapidly does that utility from watching the channel decay over time. There are diminishing marginal utilities to watching the same channel for a very long time. Perhaps you want to control for it. Okay? Being able to estimate this particular part of the model means we're able to derive measures of the marginal utility consumers obtain from different channels, as well as how fast that utility decays. One thing that's important for application is that we want to allow this marginal utility to decay differently for sports and non-sports channels. Now, just intuitively, you might think, well, a given sports event, I really care about it, but after the match ends in like 2 hours, there's not really much value I get from watching the channel anymore. Whereas CNN, I can watch it for 7 hours and I'm fine. But really, the true reason we do this is because when you look at the data, you see that if you sort of plot input fees that a channel gets against its ratings, more viewership, you see this interesting pattern where sports channels, even though they don't get watched anywhere near as much in terms of ratings, I'm sorry, take that back. For the same rating between a sports and a non-sports channel, the sports channel gets paid a much higher affiliate fee. So if you think affiliate fees map to the utilities that consumers derive from a channel, because that affects the benefits a distributor gets from carrying that channel, well, you have to rationalize it by saying people derive more utility from a sports channel than a non-sports channel for the same amount of time spent watching it. And this parameter nu is how we're going to capture that pattern in the data. I'm sorry. Maybe there is another reason for this pattern. Oh, the question is perhaps there is another reason to which perhaps it just.
You are less likely to zip between channels during the game if you are into the game.
It's an interesting show, and also.
Sure. So we've chosen the route of there's a parsimonious way of capturing this pattern. We can sort of, if you're interested, talk about other interpretations as well. But this is how it's going to be captured here. There's a sort of a critical assumption being made here, right? Again, that somehow even within category of channel, the utility that consumers derive from a channel are proportional to the amount of time spent watching that channel in the data. Right? And I think Ali in his last paper had mentioned something like the Weather Channel. Like, you may not watch it very much, But when you do watch it, it's very valuable because that little 30 minutes tells you to like get out of the house because something's coming. You know, that's not going to be completely captured here. But, you know, this is what we can do with the data.
I don't know the institutions, but can this be a result of who owns the intellectual property on sports versus on non-sports shows? Like in the competition between them?
You're reflecting the payments between the content providers and the content distributors. Interesting. Let me come back to that and we can talk through that. But we're not in this paper explicitly modeling the content production side or the acquisition side of content. But that's an important part of the business that we're not going to be talking about here. Okay. All right. So let's say you believe that the viewership model, you believe that we can transform ratings into some measure of utility. That means then we can sort of take this V star for a given household and firm F in market M. This is, again, a consumer I's utility from solving his time allocation problem across all the channels in his bundle. And that's now you want to think of as a characteristic of that particular distributor or that particular bundle. So when an individual chooses which distributor F to subscribe to, we're going to assume that that individual looks at the utility he gets from each distributor and maximizes it and chooses a distributor that delivers the highest utility. Where utility is going to be given by this following function. Some function that utility gets from channels, some other covariates, which include, I think, firm state and your dummy variables. There's going to be some random coefficient and whether it's a satellite provider or not. We think satellite has, people might have different preferences over whether they want to install a satellite dish. We have a price term here. We have a firm market time specific shock and our IID extreme value error, okay, or logit error. To obtain market shares from this, we integrate over the predicted shares for a given individual based on the joint distribution of people's preferences over channels and these terms in this utility equation. Okay. This part of the demand system and the viewership model are estimated jointly, which means that this model controls for selection of unobservable controls for selection across distributors of these consumers. Right? Consumers who have a high gamma for certain channels only on one distributor will go to that distributor more often than not, and you want to control for that when you're estimating the viewership utility model. Right? Just because people on this distributor watch this channel a lot doesn't mean the channel is great. It might just mean that distributor only has people who really love that channel. Okay? And if you sort of extrapolate it to other people in the population, you wouldn't see the same amount of viewership. Okay, so that's the distributor model. Yes. Yes, so there's, sorry, I didn't mention this. One of the instruments we use here, and it's sort of we believe is pretty good, is the state satellite tax. So interestingly, many states levy a tax to the consumer for distributors that are satellite as opposed to cable. And that tax varies across, obviously, states, but over time as well. That's going to allow us to instrument for price. All right, so now we have a demand system. We know for any potential counterfactual set of agreements between distributors and channels, what consumers would do. We know how much TV they would watch and which distributor they would choose. Now let's move to how is it that a distributor chooses its strategic controls. How is it that it chooses how to price and which channels to carry in which markets? Well, before we do that, let's write down what the profit equation is for the distributor.
Just going back to the previous slide. Do all distributors operate in all the states? Or?
So, I apologize here. What you want to think of as, there's basically states are comprised of many local markets. Okay, so this is maybe one state. Each local market essentially has, what we're going to assume, 3 distributors. One is your local cable provider, and then there's always going to be the same 2 national satellite providers. So within a state across markets, you might have Comcast here, which is cable. You might have Cox there, which is another cable guy. You might have Charter, another cable guy. So there will be cable providers who operate in many markets in the same state and also across states. But the same satellite guys will be everywhere. Does that? Oh, okay. All right. So let's talk about the distributor profits and what one of the novelties of this paper could be seen as. Okay. So when you're talking about distributor F, he's conditioning his profits on the bundle of channels he offers in a particular market, the price that he and others offer in this market as well, so the bundle and prices of all distributors in the market, and a vector of affiliate fees he's agreed to pay to each of the channels he can access, okay? And there's this parameter mu, which I'll come to in a second. So what are his profits? Well, this distributor, he gets profits from distribution. Pretty straightforward. How many people subscribe to him? It's demand in that market, multiplied by his margins. What is his pre-tax price? And what's the marginal cost of offering that bundle in that market? This marginal cost is going to be a function of these negotiated affiliate fees, as well as perhaps some market firm-specific marginal cost reflecting distribution or service or other things like that. And then you're going to have this term here. What is this? Well, this term involves the profits accruing to any channel with whom this distributor might be integrated with. So we're going to ask, okay, for every distributor in this market, if this channel C is on that distributor's bundle, and this firm owns that channel or has some ownership of that channel, that's what this variable represents, something between 0 and 1, representing the ownership share of the channel, then we're going to say the integrated channel's profits are what the channel gets. Basically, how many people subscribe to a bundle that contains the channel times the channel's revenues, which are basically the input fee it gets from that distributor plus any advertising revenue it gets per subscriber. Now, given these are integrated channel profits, we don't want to assume necessarily that the distributor always cares about the profits of any channel it owns. Rather, we're going to assume that it cares about them weighted by some parameter mu. Right? So perfect internalization would be mu is 1, no internalization, mu is 0, something in between, interpret as partial internalization or imperfect coordination internalization. Okay? Yes?
So W time watch, the time people spend watching, where does it going there?
So the time people spend watching allows us to predict the utility people get from a particular bundle of channels, which in turn affects the demand for that distributor. Yep.
So, are there independent content providers?
Yes.
And do they get the advertising revenue? Or
Yes. So the question, I'm sorry, there's a bunch of questions here. Maybe I'll start again there. If they're independent content providers, do they still obtain advertising revenues? The answer is yes. Any independent channel, their profits are basically going to sum over all distributors who carry that channel, multiplied by this guy here, input fees and advertising revenues. And we'll come to that in a sec. Well, we're going to, in this paper, the question was why is mu assumed to be the same for every distributor? I think we introduced that parameter and have not, I think there's limited data variation. I might defer that question until I talk about how we identify mu and then discuss whether there's remaining variation that might allow it to vary across distributors. But in this paper, we've sort of taken it to be common across all integrated firms. Okay. You might want to think of it just sort of a data limitation issue for now. Okay. Parsimony. Yes. Well, and why? So we're going to take sort of the stance that it's structural and that it sort of doesn't vary in our counterfactual environment, so that it actually represents something that we can hold fixed, and it's supposed to represent within the firm, perhaps agency issues or incentive issues that prevent it.
Conduct parameter in the sense that it measures like how sort of in the evolution literature it's like
I don't.
that measures how much you integrate the profits of your competitors, right?
I don't necessarily, want to make that parallel or analogy. I guess with the conduct parameter, it's not clear what would be the structural interpretation over why that would be something that we want to, say, hold fixed or, well, you know. Okay. All right. So, given this profit function, we're going to assume that every distributor optimizes its pricing and carriage decisions. That is to say, there's this pretty standard Nash-Bertrand first order condition that its price, this first order condition is equal to 0, with the difference that instead of just caring about its own changes in its own profits when it adjusts its price, also cares about how its integrated channels profits adjust when it changes its price. All right? There's also this condition that says the bundle of channels that a distributor carries in a given market is chosen to maximize its profits as well. Right? So if it doesn't carry a channel in a market, it must be that the gains from carrying that channel were negative, given the affiliate fee it had to pay to carry that channel. Okay? Questions? All right. So that part seems maybe perhaps a bit straightforward, how you might model how a downstream distributor internalizes upstream firm profits. The next part, when we talk about bargaining, we're still going to be assuming Nash-in-Nash, but there's going to be one additional complication we introduce in terms of how is it that an upstream channel internalizes its integrated downstream distributor profits when it bargains with someone else. Okay? So when we're talking about bargaining, I've already told you what a distributor's profits look like. What does an upstream firm's profits look like? Well, for a given channel in a given market, we condition on sort of a similar set of objects in that market, but there's now additional parameter lambda r. And what lambda r is an additional term that multiplies how a channel internalizes its integrated distributor profits when bargaining with a rival. Okay? So let me sort of explain it this way. Let me do it this way, actually. Imagine there's C and D and F. All these guys are in the same firm. So there's two channels owned by the same distributor. They're all integrated. Within the firm, we're going to assume that there's still some bargaining between integrated channels and distributors. Okay? Now, that's going to matter when there's imperfect coordination. When mu is 1, actually, it won't really matter because they sort of perfectly internalize each other's profits. But when it's less than 1, we're going to assume that they bargain in this fashion. However, when an integrated channel now bargains with a rival F, we're going to assume that that channel cares about its own profits. It still weights its downstream distributor's profits by mu, but there's still this additional term that we're going to call lambda r that says, well, this channel, when he bargains with a rival, may not completely internalize further his own integrated distributor's profits. Okay? It's called a rival foreclosure parameter that says what is the extent to which C wishes to foreclose F or engage in partial foreclosure of F when it's integrated. Okay? And we're going to talk a little bit more about why is it that we separate these two out and what patterns in the data motivate that decision as well. Okay? But given that's how we've defined profits for the channel, we're going to assume that every pair, F and C, that are observed to contract in the data, well, their negotiated affiliate fee maximizes their appropriately defined Nash bargaining product. Okay. So a lot of notation there, but essentially it's the same flavor as we've talked about already in the other papers. It's the same flavor as that. Any questions for that? All right. Do that one. So briefly on estimation, all these stages of the model are estimated jointly, unlike the last paper I talked about where you do stage 1, then stage 2, then stage 3, partly because of the selection issue, and partly because there is some valuable information in these demand systems that allow us to identify some parameters on the supply side, motivate that decision. Right? So how do we estimate this? Well, each component has moments in the data that we want to match the predicted outputs of the model. Okay? So household viewership, our model, remember, predicts the viewership for each channel year, also the number of households who never watch a channel, Well, those we see in the data, let's find channel utility parameters that best match, right? ESPN, a lot of people watch, so probably people derive a high marginal utility from that channel. How do we estimate preferences people have over distributors? Very similar to the BLP random coefficients demand model here, where, as I mentioned earlier, there's a satellite tax, which allows us to instrument for prices, as well as other objects to instrument for example, a bundle utility, or utility people derive from watching a set of channels. On the supply side, what's interesting here in this paper is that we actually do not observe the affiliate fee paid to a particular, we don't observe for a given channel a distributor-specific affiliate fee. Instead, what we observe is an average affiliate fee that each channel obtains. That's still a moment, however, that we can use to match with predictions of the model. Right? So we're going to take this average affiliate fee within channel across distributors and match it to what our model predicts. Right? And to some extent, you might ask yourself, how is it that these bargaining parameters are being identified? Similar intuition to before, well, if there's something that we see is correlated with these affiliate fees that enter only into, let's say, the channel's profits, that indicates that the distributors have some non-zero bargaining power. Otherwise, you wouldn't see them capturing any of those rents. And the thing we're going to be thinking about here is advertising, which really only enters in the channel's profits. Okay. We also have information on distributor markups, which is useful to infer marginal costs, and also what we call like carriage moments. So we're going to sort of impose the optimality of the bundling decision in that in every market, a distributor could carry this channel or they couldn't. There's this sort of shock, this random shock that affects the profitability of making that decision. And we sort of actually write out what the probability that our model would predict for such a decision to have been optimal. There's also something that we use, a la indirect inference, where we match predicted carriage patterns predicted by our model to the data through some sort of regression. All right? And this starts getting towards how is it that we're identifying mu and lambda r. So let me talk now about that identification here. So this is that reduced form regression that you can run in the data. The question here is whether an RSN is carried in a particular market, regressed on a few things. But one of the things is, how much does that distributor own this RSN? Right? Are they integrated or are they not? We find that integration is actually highly correlated with whether or not the channel is carried. Now that's suggestive that, well, mu might be something that's non-zero. Right? If mu were 0, well, you wouldn't predict from the model any effect of integration on carriage, certainly, right? Here's another visual representation of how we think, why we think mu, or why the model, what informs a mu that's positive, okay? What we have here are different cable systems, dots and X's, across different geographic areas of the US. Let's look at CSN New England. Here in black are all the cable systems that own CSN New England, basically Comcast systems. Everything in gray are cable systems that are not operated by Comcast. They don't own CSN New England. Circles, or dots rather, that are filled in indicate that the channel is carried on that system. X's indicate the channel is not carried in that system. What we sort of see as we sort of move away from Boston, just right here, CSN New England carries the Celtics, among other things, basketball team. As we move out, we see that more non-integrated systems are likely to drop the channel than integrated systems. Here we have sort of the northwest corner of Vermont. Okay. So it suggests that integrated distributors are facing perhaps lower marginal costs, lower affiliate fees, or perhaps internalize the benefits to the channel from actually carrying it, the advertising revenue that it receives. Okay, so here are some patterns of data again that suggest that there is some internalization that's going on. However, what's interesting is that you don't always see a Comcast distributor carrying the channel. And that's even though we might assume that the marginal cost of carrying a channel is 0. Right? The fact that there is non-carriage, maybe suggests that the distributor is not really paying the true marginal cost, and there is some markup, maybe some internal transfer price markup that this distributor who's choosing the bundle decisions in this market is facing. Okay.
But couldn't it also be because he doesn't want to divert viewers to this channel?
This is for a distributor who owns the channel.
Yeah, but he owns other channels as well.
So here we're controlling it. Well, there's no other integrated channels in these markets. In some markets, we are careful to control for what we call sister channels. That's to say, if I own 2 channels that have substitution, then that's something the model is going to try to accommodate. But within RSNs, regional sports networks, those markets in which there's 2 integrated channels are not as common.
When there's sister channels, the competition is because of advertising?
So we're going to assume in this model that advertising revenues are per viewer, and those advertising revenues do not change
No,
as a
but
result
if
of
I have 2
competition.
sister channels and I get rid of one, I might have more people watching.
Yes, so we will control for the viewership substitution patterns,
Yeah, okay.
but hold the advertising rates fixed.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So let's talk about this lambda R parameter. And why is it that we think that it might be positive, that actually when a channel negotiates with a rival, if he's integrated, does internalize downstream distributor profits when engaging in said bargaining? Well, first, we're going to ask ourselves, are there any markets where we see an integrated channel not supplied to a rival? And indeed, the answer is yes. There are these 2 markets, Philadelphia and San Diego, which fall under what I mentioned, this terrestrial loophole, which basically regulation allowed the integrated distributor to withhold the content from satellite providers. And indeed, in the data, we see that the cable distributor chose to do that. What we show in the paper is that a necessary condition for exclusion of satellite providers to be an equilibrium of some game is that there are negative, what we call 3-party surplus gains from doing so. That is to say, if there are 3 distributors and one distributor owns the channel, and in equilibrium, or in the data, we see this channel is not supplied to those other distributors, it must be the gains from actually supplying both when added to the profits of the integrated guy are negative. Right? Now, when lambda R is 0, that's the upstream firm doesn't care about its integrated distributor profits, it's going to always be the case that he actually wants to supply those other 2 guys. He's already getting some advertising and affiliate fees from this integrated distributor. But by supplying extra distributors, he's actually accessing more subscribers who only are in those distributors. So it's strictly increasing the pie. So it's very difficult to rationalize why then a channel would not want to supply those other distributors if lambda R were 0. However, as lambda R increases so that the upstream firm cares more and more and more about his integrated firm's profits, now he understands there's a cost to supplying the rivals. It's diverting people away from the integrated unit. The integrated unit makes positive markups, so that's a loss in profits. And at some point, the 3-party surplus that we compute becomes negative. Now, what we do in this paper is obtain a lower bound on what this foreclosure parameter must be to rationalize observed exclusion in these 2 markets. And what we find is that somewhere close to 1. In some cases, the lower bound is actually slightly greater than 1. Okay? And you can't reject 1 statistically, but there's a sense in which maybe a channel is completely internalizing, in some cases more than fully internalizing its downstream distributor profits when bargaining with rivals.
What does it mean to more than fully?
You could think of a dynamic game. I might not be around.
Right. One story is, I think, alluding to some of our experience in MBA classrooms, you get sometimes, maybe you might think a manager gets too caught up in trying to sort of help out his own firm and sort of thinks, maybe, or I'm maximizing market share and not profits or something. Something that causes him to not really looking at profits, but some other measure that leads him to engage in that behavior. But
Or
don't want to
den-
be, sorry,
Deny profits to rivals, and maybe they won't invest as much. or-
Yeah,
Dynamic
if
story.
They have fixed costs.
okay. So in this paper, for 26 different RSNs in the data, it's just going to simulate mergers and demergers. When we mean simulate a merger, well, in the data, sometimes channels are independent. Let's assume that they're owned by the largest cable distributor in the market. Sometimes they already are integrated, so let's simulate what would happen if they were demerged or divested. Okay? There's going to be 3 kinds of scenarios we're going to evaluate for each channel. There's going to be a scenario in which there's no vertical integration. There's a scenario in which there's vertical integration with what we call effective enforcement of program access rules, which our model is going to, we're going to model by assuming this lambda r parameter is 0. So a channel, when there's effective program access rules, is not going to be allowed to internalize its downstream distributors' profits when bargaining with rivals. And finally, there's integration without program access rules. This is as if we're in a loophole environment where an upstream channel is free to engage in, let's say, exclusionary activities or raise rivals to benefit its own integrated distributor. So a lot of numbers here. It's really quite small. And I just want to sort of give this picture to say, we do this, average it across all RSNs, do it RSN by RSN. We can look at the effects of integration, vertical integration with program access rules or without program access rules, and look at market shares, carriage, prices, what happens to the affiliate fees paid to rivals, surplus, as well as welfare. And these numbers, again, are fairly small, but what I'm going to try to do is just summarize some of the main results that we get from all these analyses. We're going to find, essentially, when program access rules are effectively enforced, which to some extent is shutting down the ability of upstream channels to engage in some of these foreclosure activities, maybe it's then not surprising that vertical integration leads to overall welfare gains. Reduction in double marginalization, increased carriage of the channel as a result. And we're going to, yes?
So, say we don't connect. I don't allow you to use my content. It could be because the price is too high or the other guy. I mean, there's going to be a prices bargain once that bargain price is there. I can always set a price that the other guy won't want it. How do I distinguish that from foreclosure?
So in our model, we're going to examine whether there's a price at which, if the distributor had access to the channel and could put it on, let's say in the satellite case, all of its systems, that both parties combined obtain positive gains from trade. So if we charge a price of infinity and it leaves the distributor not carrying the channel anywhere, sorry, take that back. The fact that we can't find a price at which there are positive gains in trades indicates that there isn't a price at any price.
There's a price if there's program access rules.
If program access rules are enforced,
Yes. Then, as long as there's a price that allows.
so we're going to find that actually supply everywhere with effective program access rules is what's going to happen. Because absent a channel internalizing its integrated downstream distributor profits, it's always going to be leaving surplus off the table if it doesn't supply all the distributors.
It doesn't necessarily have to happen.
It does not, absolutely, it does not. In our setting, that's what's going on. Perhaps if there's some other offsetting effect that pushes us against supply, that's not about these foreclosure effects, then yes, you might still see foreclosure here. From this scenario, if we sort of relax program access rules, set lambda r to its estimated lower bound, we're going to find that consumer and total welfare gains fall, perhaps unsurprisingly. But on net, we're going to find, on average, the predicted efficiency effects of VI outweigh the foreclosure effects. So on net, we're going to find consumer and total welfare increases compared to non-integration. But if we zoom in and look at the markets where there's going to be complete foreclosure, so in 4 of the markets, we predict the channels no longer supply to rival distributors, then these welfare gains are largely absent. Okay? It's just really where, the rival's still supplied, their affiliate fee has gone up by about 20%, but because the cable distributor is integrated, lower input prices it gets from its own content, lower prices, higher carriage, on net, consumers are still better off. Okay? But pretty robustly, rivals are going to be harmed when this happens. So if there are dynamic implications, exit, reduce investment, there might be other things to consider. Yes? We're going to assume that they're Nash-in-Nash bargained, but we're going to assume that lambda r, the rival foreclosure parameter, is 0. Which means here, the channel is just basically only maximizing its own profits, and distributors are maximizing their profits. And prices are determined via the same kind of Nash-in-Nash structure as before. Yes?
So how do you define total welfare?
We define total welfare by from our basically total or consumer. Oh, consumer welfare is one component. Okay. Total welfare, we're going to be looking at firm profits, but we don't use information or have information on like the fixed costs. Okay. But we're looking at essentially that calculation of firm profits plus consumer welfare to construct our measure of total welfare. Yes. So in our setting, we're going to find that foreclosure of other cable distributors doesn't occur because the cable guys don't compete with one another. So indeed, there is a way for a consumer to get access to the channel if they change distributors. But there are quite a few consumers who really like the channel, but they also really like their satellite distributor they're subscribing to. So for those guys, they don't get the channel. But that's right. I mean. All right.
Is affiliation fee correlated with one of the characteristics? Do we have endogenous problem there?
So the question is the affiliate fee correlated with endogenous character?
Unobserved characteristic of utility function.
So there's going to be many components of the utility expectation which we can think of demand shocks or unobserved. These components are going to be sort of baked into the profit function. So the model is going to mechanically sort of say that these taus are a function of all the things that we're controlling for that enter into these profit functions. Is that?
So you're using instrument to correct endogenous fee.
Yes, in the estimation of demand here. That's correct. That's correct. Okay. So what I want to do briefly is maybe the remaining 20 or so minutes, maybe spend half on, or very quickly over Ali's earlier paper, with apologies to Ali, but tell you how you can use this framework to ask a different question, but incredibly policy relevant one. It says basically how does bundling of cable TV channels affect welfare, and the reason why this was kind of an important question, still kind of is there's a lot of debate, particularly the FCC, whether to require distributors to unbundle their channels, to offer what you call a la carte pricing. And perhaps this is even more relevant these days as you see more novel, let's say over-the-top providers, internet television providers, give more variety or select more customization options to consumers. Okay? And generally there's this theoretical literature on the welfare effects of bundling. One of the important things to think about is really how dispersed are consumer preferences, how heterogeneous are they? And if you want to think about the methodological contribution, remember this is one of the first to take the Nash-in-Nash solution to data. And he does it actually in a pretty rich environment, right? Many-to-many, competition downstream. And a lot of these contributions have been built on in the papers already talked about in many, many others as well. Okay? But the reason why the bargaining frame was so important was this question of how does bundling affect welfare, really depends on what we think happens to affiliate fees and this new environment. because in the current status quo, channels are bundled, prices are negotiated in some fashion in which maybe viewership of a channel is insulated from precisely what affiliate fee charges. Once you move to a la carte pricing, it's no longer the case. Right now, channels, because there's an actual price to subscribe to ESPN, a price to subscribe to the cooking channel, there's a whole different dynamic going on when prices are determined. So maybe input fees would increase, offsetting any potential welfare benefits from the unbundling in the first place, possibly. So to sort of get at this question, he does basically something very similar to, he estimates a model of demand for channel systems and bundles, estimates input prices a la Nash-in-Nash. Slightly different from the previous work is that there's a sequential timing assumption that bargaining is done prior to downstream price setting. It's going to change the first order conditions, and it's going to affect how you compute this. That's sort of a complication that's worth noting. And he sort of simulates the industry without bundling, moving to a la carte pricing. He's going to do that in these simulated markets. And again, critically, input prices renegotiate after this move to a la carte. And so what's kind of interesting is if you held fixed these input prices and just moved from distributors offering a bundle of channels to offering them a la carte, you actually see consumers are much better off. I no longer have to pay $100 a month to get 3,000 channels I don't watch. I only buy the 5 that I do watch. Okay? But once you allow for input fees to readjust, you find that actually input costs rise on average, depends on the channel, by quite a bit. Prices rise as well, and thus the average consumer is indifferent. There's still going to be winners and losers from this regime change, but it's not so rosy of a picture once you account for the full equilibrium adjustment here. Okay? Yes?
And how would that be affected if we went back to Nash pricing?
Oh, take it or leave it prices. You mean how would this change occur?
No. Is this dependent on this different assumption about price setting?
Ali, do you want to take a stance?
I don't hear the answer. But
You're right, it's not in the bargaining, the essential part is having the channels react in some way. Bargaining is I think you get close to the right answer, having take your hash prices by the channels, relative to having no upstream adjustment. But bargaining is even better.
Ali, do you want to say anything or add anything or motivation? Okay, sorry. Just thought I'd give the option, given the authors here. Oh, and here are the numbers here. Right, so if you look at mean consumer surplus, this is under the status quo of bundling. With no renegotiated prices, you see a 20% increase in welfare, as I mentioned, but once you have renegotiated prices, the welfare effects for the average consumer sort of kind of are on net unchanged. Again, there's a redistribution, so you want to be aware of that. All right, now yes?
On this one, so isn't here important to account for the choice of channels by the provider, by the upstream producers? The choice of product, because maybe after the change of regime, they will decide that some channels will exit or rearrange the program.
The question is it important to account for changes in upstream firm, let's say the content provision? But more generally, and the answer is I believe yes, the answer is yes. I believe to sort of get at those important questions, obviously these are all steps one would need to take or one might want to take. But it's more general than just cable or even hospitals. You might think the characteristics of hospitals will adjust, entry and exit will adjust, investment decisions. Just something that's sort of outside the scope of these papers so far. And one thing that would be useful to think about is there additional data that we can bring to bear on that question? Do we have information on what teams these RSNs carry, or do we have information on how much they're spending on developing new content? And there's been some work and some progress in trying to bring in additional sources of information and get at investment changes in counterfactuals. Okay. All right, and so in the last 10, 15 minutes, what I want to talk about is sort of a recent paper with Kate Ho that, again, is in healthcare, but what I want to do, at least in the last 10, 15 minutes, is really focus on the theoretical points that it's trying to make. As been alluded to by a few questioners here, as well as maybe lurking in the background, is all these many of the papers that I've discussed in the literature have held fixed the set of contracts, or held fixed the set of contracting partners in these counterfactuals, or have not leveraged information on which network of contracting partners emerged in the data. Okay? There are exceptions, and some of them were covered today. So Nash-in-Nash, as we've seen, has been useful for applied work due to its tractability and intuitive properties, but there are some limitations. I'm going to focus on two. One is, at least some papers have applied it, it's been used as a surplus division rule for a given or exogenous set of contracts. When I mean exogenous, perhaps it's because we're estimating some underlying primitives and we just take the set of contracts in the data as given and assume that prices given those sets of contracts are determined via Nash-in-Nash. And in counterfactuals, maybe there's no recontracting, maybe there's limited recontracting. The vertical integration paper, there's some limited recontracting, but by and large, it's somewhat modest what's done here. So that's sort of point one, that Nash-in-Nash typically gives limited guidance as to which set of contracts will emerge, rather, which set of contracting partners and networks will form. Okay. There's also no outside options that are able to be used when bargaining, or rather disagreement points that involve adjustments to contracting parties. If you remember how I sort of defined or motivated the Nash-in-Nash solution, when there's a disagreement, we hold fixed the outcomes of all other bargains and all of the terms that emerge from that bargain. Well, what if there's disagreement, let's say between M1 and H1, M1 can now turn to H2. Either during the course of negotiations, he can sort of use H2 as an outside option, or if there's ever a permanent disagreement, he can then form additional contracts. Or other people can adjust. Maybe M2 sees M1 dropped H1, and M2 can now maybe drop H2 in response, for example. So there's this other paper Mike sort of mentioned that sort of looks at a dynamic game to try to enrich our understanding of disagreement points. The paper I want to talk about now doesn't really adjust the disagreement point, but rather attempts to bring in this notion of outside options as affecting negotiated prices, and perhaps also make some limited progress in terms of endogenizing what network emerges in equilibrium. Okay. So that's what this paper does. It's sort of going to develop, say, a new bargaining solution, or maybe a straightforward extension of Nash-in-Nash. We call it Nash-in-Nash with threat of replacement, that can partly address some of these limitations and rationalize, or at least parsimoniously allow us to explain why we see exclusion in the particular application we examine. Okay. Now, the applied examples really understand the motivations behind why is it that insurers drop hospitals from their insurance networks. Okay. This was a question asked by people earlier, and evaluate the welfare effects of network adequacy regulations. So in the healthcare setting, just put on your healthcare cap again. If you remember an insurer, he's trying to figure out, do I include this hospital or do I drop this hospital? Well, I might drop this hospital for several reasons. First, it might be a really expensive hospital, and absent an ability to steer patients to cheaper ones as opposed to the expensive one, maybe the only instrument I have is to drop them altogether. It's a pretty coarse instrument, but that's one reason why I might do that. The second reason I might drop a hospital is because by dropping the hospital, I might now only attract healthier enrollees. All the sick people who love that hospital will go to my rival, and now I'm left with healthy guys, cheaper to insure, I'm better off. The third reason we're also going to emphasize in this paper is maybe by dropping a hospital, I still can use that excluded hospital as leverage in my existing negotiations with the hospitals I do contract with. And I can leverage him in a way that's more effective than having included him in my network to begin with. Okay? So those three things we're going to try to measure. But anyways, I'm going to focus on one here, what's done in this paper. All right, so to sort of motivate where the solution concept comes from, it's useful to give sort of two sort of sets of intuition. One comes from this older literature on bargaining with an exogenous outside option over a single good. So just to anchor intuition, imagine I'm bargaining with Mike over $1. If we Nash bargain, 50-50, I pay him 50 cents for this object I value at $1. If I then turned to Mike and said, you know what, I have this outside option, this thing I can pick up that's worth $0.25. So I can bargain with you over this $1, or I can get this outside option worth $0.25. Is that outside option useful at all in terms of getting a better price? Well, there are some bargaining protocols that say no. That outside option is irrelevant unless it delivers more surplus to me than I would get by bargaining with him. And when it does deliver more surplus, I get exactly that amount from Mike. So to anchor it sort of in this example, if we're bargaining over $1, outside option is 25 cents. Doesn't matter. Mike knows I'm still going to bargain with him. I'll still have to pay him 50 cents for this object. If, however, that outside option is credible and observable and it's 60 cents, I now can go to Mike and say, you know what, I'm only going to pay you 40 cents for your $1 because that leaves me with a surplus of 60, makes you completely indifferent from going to that outside option. Okay, so there's some work that says why this deal me out form, the outside option this outside option principle might be realistic. All right, so that's sort of maybe nice. There's some experimental evidence suggests that helps explain laboratory outcomes. Let's move now to bargaining with multiple sellers, still over a single good. Now it's a case where I have $1 I could bargain with Mike, but now with Ariel, I can obtain a good I value at 60 cents. Is it still the case that when I bargain with Mike, it's credible to say, look, Ariel has an object worth 60 cents, you should accept just 40. Mike could tell me, look, when you go to Ariel, there's no reason he's going to give you this object for free. You're not going to keep all 60 to yourself. Maybe then, I don't have to accept this low price you're offering. Well, it turns out, actually, there are some bargaining protocols, particular Mea in a forthcoming paper, has this interesting bargaining protocol, which generates in the limit the same outcome as above, where even though there's another seller I have to negotiate with, I can treat him almost as if he's just some outside option that I extract full surplus from. And the idea behind this protocol is every period I get to choose, do I talk to Mike, do I talk to Ariel? And once I choose who to talk to, nature picks a random proposer. If the offer is accepted, bargain ends. If the offer is rejected, we go back to the next period where I again get to choose to talk to Ariel or Mike. And the equilibrium strategies that obtain this outcome are one such that I kind of randomize between Ariel and Mike. But as delta goes to 1, I sort of pick Mike more often. Which means that if I ever happen to go to Ariel, he knows he has to give me almost all of the surplus, the 60 cents. Otherwise, I'm going to say, you know what? Next period, I'm probably going to go to Mike, and I'll go with him. So this playing off each other allows the buyer, if you will, to sort of obtain the same outcome as if the outside option were sort of fixed or exogenous. And this is a similar result to one developed in this paper by Mike and Patrick Bolton. Okay. Now, so if I've given you this example, and I'm going to say now I'm going to take it to healthcare, where we're going to have now multi-good demand. Instead of a buyer, we want to think of an insurer who's now demanding services from many hospitals. He just doesn't need one hospital, he might need many hospitals. Furthermore, there's going to be externalities among contracting parties. If I contract with Mike, he may care whether I also contract with Ariel or not. And that's going to affect how much he's willing to accept for a payment for his services. Okay? So to sort of accommodate these things, well, Nash-in-Nash does that, right? So we're going to sort of blend together this stuff with a Nash-in-Nash to sort of propose this alternative bargaining solution concept called Nash-in-Nash with threaded replacement. Now, this solution concept is still defined for a given set of contracting partners and is defined just for a single downstream firm choosing among a set of upstream firms. Right? There could be non-strategic downstream firms who do other things, but let's just endogenize the network for one guy for now. As you can say, for a given set of contracting partners, there's a vector of Nash-in-Nash with threaded replacement prices where each element for each hospital I, the price he's paid by the insurer is a minimum of two objects. Something we're going to call the Nash-in-Nash price and something we're going to call the outside option price. Where the Nash-in-Nash price, it looks pretty similar to what we saw before. It's a price that the hospital would get under Nash-in-Nash bargaining, where we hold fixed the outcomes of all other negotiations at not the Nash-in-Nash price, but the NNTR price. That's the only modification to this line here. Okay, so this is outside option price. This is like me bargaining with Mike over $1. That's like 50 cents. This is the outside option price. It solves the following equation, the equality rather. It says, what is the least I can pay this hospital to make me, the insurer, indifferent between keeping that hospital and replacing that hospital with the next best excluded alternative? So swapping Mike for Ariel, who's maybe the next best alternative for him, and paying that excluded alternative its reservation price. The least amount that hospital will be willing to accept to still accept the contract, given he knows the other guy is not going to be in the network. All right. So that's just sort of, we proposed it. I'm not sure where it comes from, but just sort of, maybe it's intuitive from the previous slide. We're going to say that this network is stable if this vector of prices satisfy individual rationality constraints. That is, the price that is offered to a hospital is optimal for every hospital to accept. Okay? And we'll show in the paper that it means that you can't exclude somebody that generates more surplus than someone you do include. So the solution says if I just contract with Ariel, it generates 60 cents, but Mike's excluded generates $1. Well, it means for me to be indifferent between taking them, Ariel needs to pay me 40 cents and give me the object, which Ariel will be like, no, I don't want to do that. So that's sort of an unstable network there. Okay? And we show in the paper that you can sort of write out an extensive form that gives you the solution that just sort of takes the mean result and applies it to a more complex game. Yep. So in this extensive form, we talk about, where does it, the question is, where does the reservation price emerge from? So the question is, why does this outside option get paid the reservation, or how do you define it?
I don't know it, right? Or
So it's defined to be, if you're a hospital, you know this is the network that's going to form. You're in, you're K. Hospital I is dropped. You know everyone else's payments. I know the least amount you'd be willing to take from me so that you would still want to accept the contract.
I know that for all the hospitals that I see.
Correct. Well, the model, the underlying primitives that we've estimated allows us to compute that.
They will tell you that. Okay.
Exactly.
There's no replacement, but that's done without any kind of replacement.
This is where the reservation is calculated given this is the network that emerges, given K replaces I.
So the question is, the least amount K is willing to accept to be in that network?
Be in this network as opposed to,
Right. So there's no, at that point, there's no replacement.
exactly, at that point I is now, yes, that's right.
And then the actual transaction prices are not generally equal to that, because I imagine the reservation price is like the expected value of treating all the patients worldwide, but the actual transaction prices don't tend to be those prices in these agreements. I mean, why isn't that a better deal for the insurer to just take the reservation price than to negotiate a price with the hospital?
Well, because if this, so the question is, why doesn't the insurer actually choose to take the reservation price? And this extensive form says actually the insurer is going to be indifferent between paying the better hospital this outside option price versus going to the other guy and paying reservations. So in the empirical application, these hospitals are heterogeneous, both in some vertical and horizontal dimension. And we're going to find that the hospitals that are excluded are the ones we predict to generate less gains from trade than the ones that are included. But what's going on is the insurer, by dropping some less valuable hospital, is now really pushing down the prices it has to pay to the included hospitals. And that if you sort of adopt this protocol where now the insurer can commit before bargaining to a particular network, it now has an incentive to exclude, to then leverage. So on the equilibrium path, the delta goes to 1, you're not ever going to actually contract with this guy at the reservation price.
But so that commitment gives me a very strong threat to the hospitals that I'm bargaining with.
Right. is like when I'm bargaining with Mike and Ariel, if I just say, you know what, I just have one representative who can only negotiate one contract. That puts me in a much stronger position than if I had two guys who could agree with both, and if they do agree with both, then I don't get as good of a price. So that's critical in the sort of development of that. So just to sort of, I think I sort of alluded to this. Here's the example of how you would operate, what it looks like in a very stylish example. Imagine the managed care organization contracts with just one hospital and generates a surplus of 10. He could contract with the other hospital, get a surplus of X. If you had Nash-in-Nash bargaining here, they would just split this surplus, and the MCO would pay the hospital 5. Well, under this NNTR solution, if X is less than 5, you still get a payment of 5. It's just this X is non-credible. It's when this X becomes greater than 5, then the price he has to pay the hospital is reduced so that he's indifferent between swapping that hospital out with the other one. Okay? So, I'm not going to be able to, well, let me do this slide. I'm not going to tell you about the empirical results. This is what the paper does. It uses estimates from the last paper I described 2 papers ago, simulates what's the optimal network that maximizes different objectives under 2 different bargaining protocols. And at least the simulations indicate, without adding more stuff to the model, we have difficulty predicting any exclusion. Whereas in our data in 2005, we saw quite a bit of exclusion going on. And here's the intuition, right? So Nash-in-Nash says, if I want to reduce the payment I as an insurer make to a hospital, I need to reduce that hospital's marginal contribution to the network, gains from trade. One effective way of doing that is by adding other substitutable hospitals to the network. Every additional hospital I add makes the marginal contribution of each hospital smaller, reduces prices. Now, in contrast, NNTR allows the insurer to leverage the presence of another hospital without having to put them in the network in the first place. And so, it allows the insurer, by being able to commit to exclude, to obtain this kind of leverage. Okay? So anyways, in the interest of time, just so we don't go too far over, just to recap, maybe this is a bit redundant, but so far I've shown you a few papers. We've relied on this particular Nash-in-Nash stylized bargaining model instead of Bertrand-Nash because, Bertrand-Nash and simpler models tend to be rejected in some sense by the data. For example, upstream price cost margins are just too high than what we actually observe given downstream price elasticities. And we also use this model to predict how input prices change in a counterfactual given structural parameters in a model of price determination. Now again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this particular lecture, these counterfactuals calculate changes in the gains from trade, what we call bargaining leverage, less so on the bargaining parameter. Probably some work to be done thinking more about what goes into that. Ultimately, however, the accuracy of all of these exercises relies on the validity of the bargaining framework. There's always this question of what alternatives might also be consistent with the patterns in the data, particularly if that alternative and, say, the one used here, generate very different predictions. Okay? So there's, quite a few questions that are still open on the theory and the applied fronts. So that's how I just want to sort of end there. Happy to take questions, but thanks.